Welcome to our sanctuary. Find a comfortable position, take a deep breath, and let it go slowly. Feel the weight of the day begin to dissolve. As your mind begins to clear, let the sounds of your world fade, replaced by a soft, ancient whisper. Imagine the gentle lapping of water against the reeds of a great river, the warmth of a sun that has set and risen over the same landscape for millennia. This is the Nile, the lifeblood of a civilization that measured its existence not in years, but in dynasties, in eternities. A kingdom built on the unshakable foundation of cosmic order, where a pantheon of powerful gods governed every aspect of life and death. Their names were carved into every temple, their stories painted on the walls of every tomb. They were as real and as constant as the rising sun itself. But what happens when one man, a king endowed with the power of a living god, decides that eternity itself is wrong? What happens when he declares war not on a neighboring kingdom, but on the heavens themselves? When he orders the names of 1,000 gods, beloved for 1,000 years, to be chiseled away from every stone surface, effaced from every papyrus scroll? An entire faith, an entire culture, commanded to vanish. And what happens when, in return, history wages war on him? When his own name, his magnificent city built from scratch in the desert, his singular new world, are so thoroughly scoured from the record that for 3,000 years it is as if he never existed. He becomes a ghost, a heresy, a whisper in the desert sands. Let us drift back now, through the silence and the dust, to a time before the erasure, to an Egypt teeming with gods, unaware of the storm gathering on its golden horizon. Let us travel back together, further than written words, to a time of supreme confidence. We arrive in the heart of Egypt's 18th dynasty, a golden age forged in the crucible of rebellion. A century and a half before our story begins, the land was fractured, the north ruled by foreign kings, the Hyksos, but from the southern city of Thebes, a line of native princes rose, driving the invaders out and reuniting the two lands under their warrior pharaohs. This victory didn't just restore Egypt, it supercharged it. The kingdom transformed into an empire. Great armies marched out, north into Syria and south into Nubia, returning not with just plunder, but with tribute, with influence, with entire nations bowing to the living God on the throne. The wealth that flowed into Egypt during this time is almost impossible for us to comprehend. Gold from the Nubian mines arrived in such quantities that it was said to be as common as dust. Cedarwood from Lebanon, ebony and ivory from the deep south, lapis lazuli from the mountains of Afghanistan, all found its way to the workshops of Thebes. The capital city was a wonder of the world, a sprawling metropolis of sun-baked mud-brick homes, bustling markets, and, at its heart, colossal stone temples that seemed to hold up the very sky. To understand this world is to understand its faith. Religion was not a part of life. It was the framework for existence itself. The universe operated according to a principle called matter concept that encompassed truth, balance, order, and justice. Every celestial movement, every annual flooding of the Nile, every successful harvest was a sign that Mat was being upheld. Chaos, or Isfit, was the ever-present threat: foreign invasion, famine, civil unrest, and death. The pharaoh's primary duty, as the chief intermediary between humanity and the gods, was to maintain Mat. Every temple he built, every ritual he performed, was a reinforcement of this cosmic order. The Egyptian pantheon was a vast and ancient family, gods like Osiris, lord of the underworld, who offered the promise of resurrection. His devoted wife, Isis, the mother goddess of immense magical power. Their son Horus, the falcon-headed god, whose living incarnation was the pharaoh himself. There was Thoth, the ibis-headed scribe of the gods who measured time, and Hathor, the joyous goddess of love and music. These were not distant deities. They were woven into the fabric of daily life. Their presence felt in every village shrine, every amulet worn for protection, every prayer whispered at sunrise. But in the 18th dynasty, one god had risen to eclipse almost all others: Amun-Ra. He was the hidden one, the unseen creator deity. Originally a minor local god of Thebes, he had become the patron of the conquering pharaohs. His identity was merged with the ancient and powerful sun god, Ra, and in this new form, Amun-Ra became the undisputed king of the gods, the divine father of the pharaoh, and the supreme state deity of the empire. His temple complex at Karnak, on the east bank of Thebes, was the religious heart of the known world. It was not merely a place of worship, it was a city unto itself, a vast, sprawling estate of pylons, obelisks, sanctuaries, and sacred lakes, ever expanding with each successive pharaoh, who added their own monuments to his glory. And with the rise of the god came the rise of his priesthood. The priests of Amun-Ra were not simply holy men. They were administrators of a colossal economic empire. The temples owned vast tracts of the most fertile farmland, huge herds of cattle, fleets of trading ships, and workshops staffed by the finest artisans. The high priest of Amun was a figure of immense power, a man who could speak, it was believed, with the voice of the god himself, interpreting his will through oracles. By the time our story begins, the wealth and political influence of the Amun priesthood had become so great that it rivaled and perhaps in some ways exceeded that of the pharaoh himself. A quiet, centuries-long struggle for ultimate authority was being waged between the palace and the temple. This is the world inherited by Pharaoh Amenhotep III, the father of our subject. His nearly 4-decade reign was the absolute zenith of this golden age. He was known as Amenhotep the Magnificent, and for good reason. His was a reign not of war, but of diplomacy and unparalleled prosperity. He built on a scale that dwarfed his predecessors, erecting vast temple extensions at Karnak and Luxor, and a mortuary temple on the west bank so enormous that its entrance was marked by two 70-foot statues of himself, which we know today as the Colossi of Memphis. His court was a dazzling center of international culture. His chief wife, Queen Tai, a woman of remarkable intelligence and influence, who stood by his side as an equal partner. Yet, even in this era of supreme stability, tiny cracks were beginning to appear in the theological firmament. Amenhotep III began to place a new emphasis on the sun god, but in a more direct, physical form, the Aten, the visible disk of the sun itself. He named his pleasure barge the dazzling Aten, and increasingly referred to himself with solar epithets. It was a subtle shift, perhaps an attempt by the palace to create a more personal, universal aspect of the sun god that was not so completely controlled by the priesthood of Amun-Ra at Karnak. It was a theological counterbalance, a seed of an idea, but under the magnificent king it remained just that, a seed, planted in the fertile but increasingly contested ground of Egyptian religion. Into this world of immense wealth, complex politics, and simmering religious tension, a son and heir was born. He was named Amenhotep, like his father, a name that meant Amen is satisfied. From his birth, he was destined to become the next Horus king, the upholder of Mat, the dutiful son of Amun-Ra. We know so little of his youth. The records are silent, which in itself is unusual for a crown prince. Was he a sickly child, kept away from the rigors of court life? Did he spend his time in the palace libraries, absorbing ancient texts? Or did he simply stand in the long shadow of his magnificent father and his powerful, charismatic older brother, Thutmose, who was originally the heir, but died young? Whatever the reasons for his quiet youth, when the great Amenhotep III finally died and was laid to rest in the Valley of the Kings, Egypt turned its eyes to his successor. The young man who ascended the throne as Amenhotep IV was an enigma. The priests at Karnak would have expected him to follow the path of his ancestors, to honor the gods, to enrich the temples, to build monuments to Amun-Ra, and to maintain the delicate balance of power that had made Egypt the greatest nation on earth. No, one could have predicted that this quiet prince, who bore the very name of their god, was about to unleash a revolution that would tear the cosmos apart. They believed they were crowning a pharaoh. They had no idea they were crowning a heretic. The new pharaoh, Amenhotep IV, did not begin with a thunderclap. His first years on the throne were quiet, almost deceptively conventional. He was crowned in Thebes, observing the ancient rites. He commissioned buildings within the sacred precinct of Karnak, the very heartland of Amun-Ra's power. But there was a difference, a strangeness in the work. The temples he built were dedicated not to Amun, but to the Aten, and the style in which they were decorated was unlike anything Egypt had ever seen. For 1500 years, Egyptian art had been governed by a strict canon of idealized perfection. Pharaohs were depicted as eternally young, muscular, serene figures, more divine symbols than men. The art of Amenhotep IV was jarringly different. On the walls of his new temples, he appeared as a strange, almost alien figure. His face was elongated, with full lips, heavy-lidded eyes, and a long, slender neck. His body was depicted with a narrow torso, a sagging potbelly, wide hips, and spindly legs. It was a shocking break from tradition. Was this how he truly looked, or was this a new, symbolic iconography? A deliberate shattering of the old forms to signal the shattering of old ideas. His beautiful chief wife, Nefertiti, and their young daughters were shown with similarly exaggerated features. And the scenes themselves were revolutionary, where pharaohs were once shown smiting enemies or communing stoically with gods. Amenhotep IV was depicted in moments of startling intimacy, kissing his daughters, holding them on his lap, with Nefertiti by his side as a new. Overlooking them all was not a human-like god, but the Aten itself, a golden disk whose rays ended in tiny hands, extending the symbol of life, the Ankh, only to the nostrils of the king and his queen. This was more than a stylistic choice. It was a theological manifesto carved in stone. The message was clear. Divine life flows from the sun, and it flows only through the pharaoh and his family. The priesthood of Amun must have watched this unfolding heresy within their own sacred walls, with a mixture of confusion and horror. But the king held all the power, and this was only the beginning. In the 5th year of his reign, the quiet revolution became an open war. The pharaoh cast off the name he was given at birth. He was no longer Amenhotep. Amen is satisfied. He declared himself Akhenaten, effective for the Aten. With this single act, he severed his ties to the patron god of his empire and his ancestors. Soon after, he made an even more radical decision. He would abandon Thebes, the city of Amun, the capital of Egypt for centuries. He would leave its grand temples, its corrupt and powerful priests, its entire history behind. He would build a new city, from scratch, on virgin desert soil, a place untouched by the worship of any other god. He chose a site 200 miles north of Thebes, a vast semicircle of cliffs on the eastern bank of the Nile. Here, he declared, he would raise a new capital for a new Egypt. He called it Akhenaten, the horizon of the Aten. The founding of the city was marked by a series of great stone stelae carved into the surrounding cliffs, demarcating its boundaries. On them, Akhenaten recorded his oath. He would never leave this place. This city would be the one and only center of the universe, the earthly home of the one true God. A frenzy of construction began. Tens of thousands of workers were conscripted, and within a few short years, a massive city rose from the sands. It was a city designed for the sun. The great temples were not dark, mysterious sanctuaries with hidden inner chambers like those at Karnak. They were vast open-air courts, filled with thousands of offering tables, all open to the sky, allowing the rays of the Aten to pour down unimpeded. There were grand palaces, administrative buildings, sprawling villas for the nobles who had followed their king into this desert experiment, and a tightly packed village for the tomb workers and artisans who served them. The city was laid out along a grand processional way, the royal road, along which Akhenaten and Nefertiti would ride their chariots in daily ceremony, a public display of their unique communion with their god. Here, in his isolated city, Akhenaten's theology crystallized. At first, he had promoted the Aten as the supreme god among many. Now, he went further. All other gods were declared false. They did not exist. There was only the Aten, the universal creator, the giver of life, not just to Egypt, but to all lands and all peoples. This was a breathtaking leap, from a rich and ancient polytheism to something very near to absolute monotheism. We can still hear the beauty and power of this new faith in the words of a hymn, found inscribed in a tomb at Akhenaten, a text often called the Great Hymn to the Aten. It reads, in part, "How manifold it is, what thou hast made. They are hidden from the face of man. O sole God, like whom there is no other. Thou didst create the world according to thy desire, whilst thou wert alone. The world came into being by thy hand, according as thou hast made them. When thou hast risen they live, when thou settest they die. Thou art in my heart, and there is no other that knoweth thee, save thy Son Akhenaten." These last lines are the key. The Aten was a universal god, but he was also a distant, unknowable one. He had no myths, no personality, no form other than the blinding sun in the sky. He could not be approached through prayer or ritual by the common person. The one and only path to the god was through the god's son, Akhenaten himself, and his wife Nefertiti. The people were not to worship the Aten. They were to worship the royal family, who would then convey their devotion to the god. Every home in the city of Akhenaten had a small shrine, but it contained not the image of a god, but a carving of the royal family. They had become the sole focus of worship. This new religion also brought with it a terrifying void. The ancient Egyptian faith was built around the promise of the afterlife, the journey through the underworld, the judgment of the soul by Osiris, the hope of living forever in the field of reeds. These were core beliefs that had sustained the people for millennia. Akhenaten swept it all away. The Aten gave life, but when you died, you simply ceased to exist. There was no underworld, no judgment, no Osiris. The only hope for any form of continued existence was to have your name remembered by the king. For a people so deeply invested in the elaborate preparations for eternity, this must have been a devastating and fearful new reality. As the years passed in Akhenaten, the king's vision grew harder, more militant. His early tolerance for the old gods vanished completely. He now saw them as a direct threat to the truth of the Aten, and so he unleashed a campaign of iconoclasm on a scale never before witnessed. He sent teams of workmen throughout the entire length of Egypt, from the delta to the borders of Nubia, with a single, chilling task: to erase the names of the old gods, especially that of his great rival, Amun-Ra. Imagine the scene. A small crew of men with mallets and chisels arrives at a towering temple pylon, a monument that has stood for 100 years. They erect scaffolding and, stone by stone, they begin to methodically chip away the name of Amun wherever it appears. They work their way through the grand halls, into the sacred sanctuaries, defacing the cartouches of Akhenaten's own ancestors, even that of his magnificent father, Amenhotep III. They move on to tombs, to statues, to public monuments. It was a meticulous, cold, and systematic campaign. Even the plural word gods was ordered to be chiseled out of inscriptions, a war on language itself. This was not just destruction. It was an attempt to retroactively alter reality, to make it so the gods of Egypt had never existed at all. The psychological shock to the populace must have been profound. It was as if the very foundations of the world were being dismantled, while Akhenaten was absorbed in his religious war at home. The great Egyptian empire his ancestors had built was beginning to fray. Proof of this comes from a remarkable archaeological find, a collection of clay tablets discovered in the ruins of Akhenaten, now known as the Amarna letters. They are the diplomatic correspondence from the vassal kings and rulers of the Near East, written in the international language of the day, Akkadian cuneiform. Letter after letter pleads for the pharaoh's attention. Cities are under siege, alliances are breaking. Loyal vassals beg for Egyptian soldiers to help them fend off hostile neighbors and encroaching powers like the Hittites. One desperate king writes, "Let the king, my lord, send troops. For if no troops come in this year, all the lands of the king, my lord, will be lost." The replies from Akhenaten, if any were sent, seemed to have been few and far between. His focus was inward, on his city and his god. The great empire, the source of Egypt's immense wealth and security, was being neglected, its borders slowly shrinking, its influence waning. The dream of Akhenaten, the perfect city dedicated to the sun, also began to sour. The utopia was not as golden as it seemed. Sometime around the 12th year of Akhenaten's reign, the radiant queen Nefertiti, his constant partner in power and worship, disappears from the historical record. Her name is no longer mentioned, her image no longer carved. Did she die? Did she fall from grace? Or did she, as some theories suggest, take on a new name and role as a ruler, becoming the mysterious pharaoh known as Smenkhare, who appears briefly at the very end of this period? We simply do not know. Her absence leaves a hole in the story, a sudden silence. Tragedy struck the royal family in other ways. A plague appears to have swept through the city. The tombs Akhenaten had carved for his family in the eastern cliffs began to fill. At least 3 of his beloved daughters died young, their funeral processions winding through the streets of the city built to celebrate life. The intimate family scenes that so defined the early years of his reign gave way to images of profound grief, the king and queen weeping over the bodies of their children. The sun-drenched city must have felt a growing chill. The single-minded devotion that had created this place began to feel like a trap, an isolation from the rest of the world and from the comforts of tradition that had sustained Egypt through every other crisis. Akhenaten reigned for 17 years. His death, like so much of his life, is shrouded in mystery. We do not know how he died or exactly when. He was likely buried in the royal tomb he had prepared in the cliffs east of his city. His revolution, an entire worldview built upon the singular, charismatic vision of one man, could not survive him. It was too radical, too personal, too alien to the ancient soul of Egypt. He was succeeded briefly by the enigmatic Smenkhare, who then also vanished. Power then passed to the last remaining male heir of the royal line, a young boy of about 9 years old. He was one of Akhenaten's sons, or perhaps his younger brother. He had grown up in the city of the sun, and his name was Akhenaten, the living image of the Aten. For a few years, he ruled from Akhenaten, a child king presiding over a dying dream. But the pressure from the old establishment, the courtiers, the generals, and the newly resurgent priests of the forbidden gods, was too great. A decision was made. The court would abandon Akhenaten, leaving its sun-bleached temples and palaces to the desert winds. They would return to Thebes, and upon their return, the boy king made the final concession. He changed his name. Tutankhaten, the last vestige of the heresy, became Tutankhamun, the living image of Amun. The revolution was over. The gods of Egypt had returned, and now they would have their revenge. The return to Thebes was not a triumphant procession. It was a quiet, solemn retreat from a dream that had died. The young king, now called Tutankhamun, was a symbol of this profound reversal. Under the guidance of the old guard, the powerful figures who had survived the heresy, he issued a great decree, a text we now call the Restoration Stele. Its words are a carefully crafted condemnation of the past 2 decades. It speaks of a time when the temples of the gods had fallen into ruin, their shrines overgrown with weeds. It describes an Egypt abandoned by its divine protectors, a land where prayers went unanswered, where the army was weakened, and the nation's heart was in sorrow. It was a formal declaration that the Atenist experiment had been a catastrophic failure, a violation of and it was a promise to make things right, to reopen the temples, to remake the divine statues, and to restore the vast wealth and privilege of the Amun priesthood. And what of Akhenaten, the horizon of the Aten? The city built as an eternal monument to a singular truth was now the symbol of a colossal era. Its purpose gone, its people followed the court back to Thebes and Memphis. The wind whispered through empty colonnades and open-air temples. Dust began to settle on the painted floors of the royal palaces. Within a few decades, its dismantling began. The beautiful city was treated as a quarry. its stone blocks and columns hauled away to be used in new construction projects dedicated to the very gods it was built to deny. The royal tomb was violated, its contents likely destroyed or moved. The city was left to the desert, and the desert, patient and thorough, began its slow work of burial. The sand drifted over the avenues and villas, and the horizon of the Aten sank below the horizon of memory. But forgetting was not enough. The wound Akhenaten had inflicted on the soul of Egypt was too deep. The restoration required a more active form of healing, a more complete and deliberate erasure. This was the damnatio memoria, the condemnation of memory. Under the pharaohs who followed Tutankhamun, particularly the general-turned-king Horemheb and the great rulers of the 19th dynasty, Seti I and Ramesses II, a systematic campaign began to excise the heretic and his immediate successors from the historical record. The process was meticulous. Any remaining temples Akhenaten had built were now fully torn down. At Karnak, thousands of the smaller standardized stone blocks from his early shrines, what we now call talatat, were used as worthless rubble, filler for the foundations and interior of massive new pylons built to glorify Amun-Ra. His name, his image, his very existence were chiseled away from every monument that had somehow been missed in the first wave of destruction, and most definitively, the official lists of kings, carved in stone for eternity, were revised. The record now showed the magnificent Amenhotep III being succeeded directly by Horemheb, Akhenaten, Nefertiti, Smenkhare, Tutankhamun. The entire Amarna period, a span of nearly 30 years, was rendered a historical void. It was as if they had never been. For 3,000 years, the erasure was almost perfect. The pharaoh who had tried to reshape the heavens became less than a ghost. He was a blank space, an unknown number of lost years in an otherwise impeccable timeline. Egypt's history was healed, its cosmic order restored. The memory of the heretic king slept, buried under the desert sands and the weight of official silence. But history holds its breath. In the 19th century, modern explorers and archaeologists began to uncover the ruins at a place the locals called Tel el-Amarna. They found the remains of a strange and beautiful city, its art unlike anything known. They found the boundaries steely, with their oaths from a forgotten king. They found the clay tablets of the Amarna letters, revealing a voice from the lost years. And at Karnak, as they studied the great pylons, they realized that the rubble within was made of decorated blocks. Slowly, painstakingly, they began to extract them, tens of thousands of them, and piece them together like a vast, ancient puzzle. The forgotten temples, the strange, elongated faces, the intimate family scenes, and the name of the king who had been so thoroughly erased, re-emerged into the light. The man who wished to be the sole intermediary to the one true God, who tried to erase a pantheon, was himself subjected to the most complete erasure imaginable. And yet, the very stones used to bury his memory became the archive that preserved it. The story was too powerful to remain silent. The desert could not hold it. His name, Akhenaten, once a whisper of heresy, now echoes again, a timeless question about faith, power, and the limits of revolution. And so, let that echo fade. Let the sands of Amarna drift across your mind. Let the story dissolve back into the silence from which it came. There is only the quiet now, the gentle flow of the great river, the warmth of the sun on ancient stone, and the deep, peaceful rhythm of your own breathing in and out.